The Deep Dive. Today, we are taking on, well, one of the most explosive and just defining political transformations in all of human history, the French Revolution.
It's a huge topic.
It is. It's a story that has everything. You've got the highest ideals of the Enlightenment. You have the sharpest realities of economic despair and this terrifying speed with which a society could just collapse.
Right, from absolute monarchy to radical terror and then something else entirely.
Exactly, into the arms of a military strongman.
It really is the ultimate blueprint for, for analyzing rapid societal collapse and reconstitution. And the sources we've pulled together for this deep dive, they're really robust.
What are we looking at?
We have everything from detailed economic records, official decrees, diplomatic letters, and, crucially, those foundational historical documents like the Declaration of the Rights of Man.
That's right. And our mission today is very targeted. We aren't just here to recite a list of dates. We're tracking the mechanism of change. We want to isolate the specific pressure, the social, the economic, the military, that took France from what looked like a stable world power in 1780 to, well, a chaotic republic just 9 years later.
It's all about the cause and effect chain.
Yes. Why did it happen the way it did? And why do those founding ideas, even with all the incredible violence, why do they still form the architecture of modern political thought?
So our goal is really to extract the most important insight. We're going to follow the path from the financial collapse of the monarchy right up to that final messy conclusion in 1799.
We'll look at the context, the tipping points,
the key moments of confrontation, and the ultimate, and I think for many, surprising end.
Okay, let's unpack this. And I think we have to start with the core contradiction of the Ancien regime. So if you were an outsider looking at France in the late 1700s, especially through, let's say, the lens of diplomacy or culture, it really looked like the apex of European civilization.
Absolutely. The center of the world in many ways.
We see all these descriptions of Paris as the intellectual capital of Europe. French was the language of every elite court. And Versailles was the envy of every king and queen on the continent.
That's the deceptive appearance right there. Outwardly, it seemed rich, powerful, culturally dominant.
But that cultural dominance was, well, it was masking a financial crisis of truly epic.
It really was. The sources are clear on this. Internally, the entire system, what we call the Ancien regime, the whole social and political structure, it was, and this isn't an exaggeration, literally falling apart.
And the reason was pretty straightforward, right?
It was structural insolvency. I mean, the government was drowning in debt.
And the sources repeatedly point to some very specific geopolitical decisions that dug this financial black hole. It wasn't just, a king spending too much on parties, though that didn't help.
No, the key expenditures were foreign wars. France had been locked in the struggle with Britain for a global supremacist decade. You had the 7 Years' War, which was incredibly expensive and, well, disastrous.
And then the big one.
Critically, yes. Supporting the American War of Independence.
A decision driven almost entirely by a desire to weaken Britain.
It was a form of financial suicide, really. France committed massive resources. We're talking naval fleet, troops, and most importantly, finance to make sure America won.
Which was celebrated as this huge triumph abroad.
But the cost of fighting a war across the Atlantic, on top of all the debt they already had, it just pushed the French treasury past the point of no return. They effectively bankrolled American liberty while signing their own bankruptcy.
And while the nation is maneuvering on the world stage and sinking into ruin, the spectacle of the monarchy just continues.
Unabated, yeah.
You have this incredible visceral contrast. The royal court, centered at Versailles, living in just unimaginable luxury. The descriptions of their spending on palaces, on fashion, on these endless ceremonies. It paints a picture of a total disconnect from reality.
But here's a really critical analytical point. If the state was bankrupt, how did the king keep funding Versailles? How did he keep funding the army?
Right. Where was the money coming from?
The answer is in the deeply flawed financial instruments of the time. The king was borrowing money at incredibly high interest rates, often from wealthy financiers.
So they were just kicking the can down the road.
Exactly. They were relying on future tax revenue to cover today's spending on a scale that they just didn't have the capacity to collect taxes for anymore.
Meanwhile, the ordinary people were the ones expected to pay for all this, for the global posturing, for the royal extravagance. And their suffering wasn't some abstract concept. It was intensely material. The economic records we looked at illustrate this in, frankly, painful detail.
Yeah, the burdens on the populace were really twofold. First, you have heavy tax. And because of the structural inequality of the ancient regime, these fell almost entirely on the common.
And second,
chronic food shortage. The combination of those two things created the powder keg.
Let's dig into those taxes for a second, because the system itself feels like it was designed to fail. The state wasn't even collecting them efficiently.
No, they were often farmed out to private contractors. These guys were called tax farms. They'd pay the state a lump sum up
and then squeeze the populace for as much as they possibly could and pocket the difference.
Exactly. And on top of that, the whole system was just riddled with exemptions for the powerful.
That's the key. The first estate, the clergy, and the second estate, the noble, they enjoyed all these extensive privileges, often including complete exemption from the very direct taxes that were supposed to be funding the king's wars.
That's right. So the vast majority of the tax burdened things like the taille, which was a land tax, the vingtième, an income tax, and consumption taxes like the infamous gabelle on salt. All of it fell squarely on the shoulders of the third.
Which was everyone else.
Yeah.
The peasants, the urban workers, the rising middle class. But the real immediate trigger, the emotional tipping point that turned all this resentment into revolutionary, it wasn't just the tax rate. It was the price of a basic necessity. Let's talk about bread.
Skyrocketing bread price. This is the detail that historians come back to again. In pre-industrial France, bread it was survival.
It was the absolute staple of the urban and the rural poor.
A stable price meant a poor family could get by. A price shock meant starvation, period.
And sources show just how devastating this crisis was. It was made even worse by terrible harvests in 1788.
I mean, during normal times, bread might take up maybe 50% of a poor Parisian worker's income.
Which is already a huge amount.
It's huge. But in 1789, that percentage just soared. We're seeing estimates of 80% or even 90% of a family's entire income dedicated just to buying the minimum amount of bread they live.
Imagine that. 90% of your paycheck going to one single grocery item.
This is that critical connection between economics and political fervor. You can live under an oppressive tax system for decades, but you cannot survive when a loaf of bread costs you a whole day's wage. The sources capture this perfectly. People were, quote, hungry, angry, and felt unheard.
And that combination is just so potent. Hunger creates this raw desperation. Anger gets targeted at the privileged elite who are visibly not starving.
Right.
And feeling unheard confirms that the political system has no escape valve, no mechanism for pressure relief. This mix of national debt, royal extravagance, structural inequality, and just immediate grinding starvation. It set the stage for the whole system to snap by 1789. It was primed for an explosion. So that economic pressure point, that existential crisis over bread,
Right.
it found its political expression in the rigid social structure of France, the three estates.
Right.
And this division is absolutely essential to understand because it explains why the king's attempt to solve the problem actually became the crisis itself.
The structure was, it was feudal and just incredibly entrenched. The first estate was the clergy. They represented less than 0.5% of the population.
Tiny?
A tiny fraction. Yet they held a huge amount of land and were generally exempt from taxes.
And the second estate,
The nobles. About 1.5% of the pop. They held the titles, the political power, the top military positions, and again also enjoyed major taxes.
and then you have the third, which was simply everyone else.
Everyone else. This is the vast peasantry, the urban workers who were called the sans-culottes, and this wealthy, educated, professional class known as the bourgeoisie. That one single estate, it represented almost 98% of the entire country.
And there's the statistical and political injustice right there. That 98% was shouldering nearly the entire financial burden of the state.
And the bourgeoisie in particular, they were wealthy, they were increasingly well educated, they'd been reading all the Enlightenment philosophers, but they were completely shut out of any real political influence. They didn't have a noble title. They had the money, but none of the status or power.
So King Louis VI, he knows the debt is crushing his government. The treasury is empty. So in 1788, he takes this pretty dramatic step. He calls a meeting of the Estates General.
Which was a huge deal. This was a national assembly that hadn't met since
175 years.
Exactly. And his hope was to get the representatives of all three estates together to agree on new tax, specifically to finally get the first and second estate.
A top-down fix for a financial problem.
But the representatives of the third estate, especially those educated lawyers and merchants from the bourgeoisie, they showed up demanding more than just financial. They wanted structural. They were just tired of being the statistical majority, but the political minority.
And the system was rigged against them from the very start. Can you walk us through the voting mechanism? Because it guaranteed the status quo would win.
Absolutely. The traditional way of doing things was voting by order. What that means is each of the three estates got one collective vote.
One vote per group, not per person.
Exactly. So the 98% in the third estate had one vote. And the privileged 2%, the clergy and the nobility, they could always outvote the third estate 2-1 on any issue that threatened their privileges.
It was a complete dead end.
The third estate saw this immediately. They demanded voting by head, where every single representative got one vote. And since the king had already agreed to let the third estate double its number of representatives, voting by head would have given them a numerical advantage.
And what did the king do?
He hesitated, the nobles refused, and that's the moment the system completely broke.
This stalemate, it led to the decisive revolutionary action that the sources all cite as the real intellectual first step of the revolution.
On June 17, 1789, totally frustrated by the nobility's refusal to budge, the representatives of the common people basically declared, "We are the nation."
This wasn't a request for reform anymore. They were claiming a new source of legitimacy.
They broke away from the official meeting entirely, and critically, they declared themselves the National Assembly, claiming that they, and they alone, spoke for the entire people of France.
And then the king tried to lock them out of their meeting hall.
He did, so they famously moved to a nearby indoor tennis, and this led to the incredibly symbolic tennis court oath on June 20th.
What did they swear?
They swore an oath that they would not stop meeting, they would not disband, until they had written and established a new constitution for France.
This was, for all intents and purposes, a constitutional coup d'etat. They were asserting that sovereignty, the supreme authority to govern, didn't come from the king.
No. It resided in the people they represented. This idea of popular sovereignty was a direct import from Enlightenment philosophy, and they were putting it into practice under extreme pressure.
The king, she eventually gave in. He recognized the National Assembly, but at the same time, he started moving troops to surround Paris.
Right, which sends a pretty clear message that he was planning to crush them with force if he had. Our sources all cite the Assembly's declaration and that oath as the well-documented first big step toward revolution. Before any major blood was shed, the authority of the monarchy had been fundamentally challenged by this declaration of popularity.
So the king's reaction, bringing in the troops, that was the catalyst. It moved the revolution from the debating halls right into the streets of Paris.
Exactly. He also dismissed his popular finance minister, Jacques Necker, who everyone saw as being sympathetic.
And that dismissal, combined with the sight of royal troops circling Paris, it just signaled to the Parisian population that a counterstrike.
It created immediate and widespread panic.
And you have to remember the climate. It's already boiling over with political excitement, but also desperate hunger. Those bread prices are still sky high, so rumors just spread like wildfire.
The people of Paris felt threatened, and they realized they needed to arm themselves. They started spontaneously forming militias to defend the city and the National Assembly.
And this realization leads directly to that critical moment on July 14th, 1789. The crowd needed weapons, but even more than that, they needed gunpowder, and they knew there was a major stash of it at the fortress prison, the Bastille.
It's so interesting the difference between what the Bastille actually was and what it symbolized.
Right. Our sources make it clear that, practically speaking, it was almost empty. It only held 7 prisoners at the time.
That's right, mostly just common criminals. But its symbolic power was enormous.
Why was that?
Well, it was this menacing medieval fortress looming over the city, and it was synonymous with the king's arbitrary power, the power to issue lettres de cachet warrants that let him imprison anyone without a trial, without any charges. It was the ultimate symbol of royal tyranny.
So storming the Bastille, it was about 2 things: dismantling an oppressive symbol and getting military supplies.
Precise. The crowd marched on it, and after a bloody struggle, the governor was killed. They seized the weapons and the gunpowder inside.
And then, in the days and weeks that followed, they did something even more bold.
A phenomenal act of communal defiance. They started to physically tear it down, brick by brick. That image of the people literally dismantling the physical building of the old regime became the official, visceral birth of the French Revolution.
It cemented the link between the political ideas of the National Assembly and the physical power of the mobilized.
That defiance was so immediate and powerful that July 14th is still the national holiday in France today, Bastille Day. But the energy didn't just stop in Paris. What happened next showed just how fragile the king's authority had become across the entire country.
The revolution just spread.
It spread across the country in a period known as the Great Fear. Nobles, seeing this sudden, violent end to their centuries-old security, they started fleeing the country in droves. They were the first wave of the emigration.
And the cities followed Paris's lead.
Yes, cities all over France rose up, seizing control of their own municipal government. And out in the countryside, the revolution took on this distinctly agrarian and brutal form. Peasants who felt centuries of oppression, they attacked the estates of their landlords.
And these weren't just random acts of violence, were they?
No, they were very specific. They targeted the symbols of feudal oppression. They would storm the manor house and tear up the records that detailed all their feudal obligations, their rents, their debts, the very documents that kept them tied. This massive, coordinated eruption showed that the king's authority had just evaporated.
Replaced by what?
By revolutionary committees and this new, popular, and sometimes very violent.
So with the Ancien regime basically dismantled in Paris and being torn down in the countryside, the National Assembly knew they couldn't just govern by chaos. The sources note there was an immediate demand for real rights. They had to build a philosophical foundation for this new France.
A crucial step. And it led directly to the drafting of the Declaration of the Rights of Man It was written in the white heat of the Revolution in August of 1780. It's a cornerstone historical document. You could argue it's the single most important export revolution.
And it wasn't a law. Not really. It was more of a political manifesto. It was designed to replace the divine right of kings with this new concept of natural human right. Can you detail the core ideas?
The Declaration is built around these huge universal principles. The core demands were liberty, equality, and fraternity, though fraternity as a concept came a bit later. The initial political focus was on the first.
And the right to participate in government.
And that yes. Liberty, in this context, wasn't just some abstract idea of freedom. It meant specific things. Freedom from arbitrary arrest, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press. It was a direct reversal of the king's power to just lock people up.
And equality.
Equality meant legal equality. The idea that all citizens were equal before the law, no matter their birth or their social. This strikes right at the heart of the estate system, where your status dictated your right. Article 6 states that the law must be the same for all, whether it protects.
And crucially, that right to participate in government. It affirms the principle of popular sovereignty that the National Assembly had already established.
Yes. It says that the source of all authority, all sovereignty, resides essentially in the nation. No individual, no group could exercise authority unless it came directly from the.
It also introduced other concepts that really define modern government, like the security of property, which was a huge demand from the wealthy Third Estate members.
And the right to due process. It defined public force and taxation, not as the king's personal tools, but as things that were necessary for the maintenance of public authority and for the general utility.
So this document, it marks the first real attempt to define a whole new political system based on these universal concepts. It's a sharp, clean break from the old, rigid estate system where your rights were something you inherited.
But this brings up a really important contradiction we have to talk about. The language was universal, man and citizen, but the application was not. The sources show the Declaration's rights did not immediately extend to women, who were still completely excluded from political participation, or to the enslaved people in France's colony.
So isn't that just inherently hypocritical? You have a revolution sparked by starvation, defined by these abstract, universal rights, and it fails to immediately extend those rights to half the population and to people held in bondage. How do historians square that circle?
That paradox is critical. Historians usually analyze it by pointing out that the rights were initially defined by the people in power, the landowning, educated bourgeoisie. They were fighting for their political power. They wanted to dismantle aristocratic privilege, not necessarily spark a radical social revolution across every demographic.
So the concept of citizen was narrow.
It was often tied to property ownership, even as the philosophical language they used was incredibly broad. It just shows that political change is often incremental, and it's driven by the specific interests of the class that's seizing power, even if they use universal language to get there.
So the Declaration was the blueprint, but a deeply flawed one. It would take decades more struggle to even begin to fulfill its own promise. Still, it's the ultimate irony. The immediate need for bread led to the ultimate demand for liberty, all encapsulated in this one philosophical document.
So even with the inspiring language of the Declaration and the creation of a constitutional monarchy, the transition, it stalled. And the king's response to this new framework, well, it proved fatal, both for him and for the revolution's initial moderate.
What did he do?
Louis VI just hesitated. He wouldn't fully accept the new limits on his power.
And that hesitation was dangerous. The monarchy started to be seen not just as slow, but as actively hostile to the revolution. The real turning point in public trust was the king's disastrous attempt to flee Paris in June 1791, the flight to Varennes.
Yes. When the king and his family were caught trying to escape France, it confirmed the radicals' deepest fears.
Which were?
That the king had no interest in being a consular monarch, that he was actively conspiring with foreign enemies, with other monarchies across Europe, to come back and restore his absolute authority by force. He was now as a traitor to the nation.
And that betrayal just fed the political extremes. The moderate voice, the ones who just wanted a stable constitutional monarchy, they were increasingly drowned out by radical factions who wanted a complete, definitive break with the past.
The most prominent of these were the Jacobins. They started as a debating club, but they grew into this influential national network of political clubs connecting Paris with all the provinces. And their ideology shifted very quickly from moderate conservatism to this hardline belief in a centralized, virtuous republic to be achieved by any means.
This push for radicalism, it leads to the definitive breakpoint. By 1792, the sources say things just spiraled. Revolutionary France was now at war with a coalition of European monarchies, Prussia and Austria, who wanted to restore the king.
And the revolutionaries realized they couldn't fight a war for the Republic while keeping a king they believed was actively collaborating with the enemy.
So in September 1792, the revolutionary government took the second great constitutional step. They abolished the monarchy completely.
That was the moment of the full Republican Declaration. France was formally a republic, and they even symbolically reset the calendar to year one.
And that decision, it set the stage for the ultimate gruesome fate of the royal family. Confirmed by, every historical source from that period, King Louis XVI was put on trial by the National Convention for treason.
The trial itself was a highly politicized drama. The charge was that he was a traitor who had conspired against the liberty of the nation. The verdict guilty was actually achieved by a fairly narrow vote, but the sentence was death.
He was executed by guillotine in January 1793, and this wasn't just a political assassination. It was a profound act of regicide.
The killing of a king.
Yeah, a ritual destruction of the whole concept of divine right that had propped up monarchies in Europe for over 1,000 years. It sent an unmistakable message to every crowned head in Europe. Your authority is conditional.
And it didn't stop there. The symbolic end of the monarchy was completed a few months later when Queen Marie Antoinette, who was seen as the ultimate symbol of royal opulence and foreign extravagance, met the same fate. The public execution of the king and queen cemented the violence and the finality of the revolution in the popular imagination. It delighted revolutionaries and, at the same time, galvanized monarchical opposition across the entire continent.
So the king is executed, the republic is declared. You'd think France might stabilize, but instead the sources introduce this next horrifying fate, which they describe as one of the darkest chapters of the revolution, the Reign of Terror.
The terror was really a desperate reaction to an egg crisis. The new republic felt completely cornered. They were fighting internal counter-revolutionary uprisings like in the Vendée region, and at the same time, they were facing invasion from the combined armed monarchical Europe.
So in this climate of total war and intense paranoia,
radical leaders created a mechanism of fear to secure the revolution at any cost.
And the primary leader of this phase, as our sources note, was Maximilien Robespierre, often called the Incorruptible.
Right. And the government structure he dominated was the Committee of Public Safety. It was an executive body that was supposed to manage the war effort, but it very quickly gained dictatorial control over domestic politics.
And Robespierre's ideology was rooted in this chilling concept that virtue must be secured through terror.
He famously said that terror was merely justice, prompt, severe, and inflexible. And under that philosophy, they just systematically purged dissent. Not just royalists or nobles, but moderate revolutionaries, priests, anyone whose loyalty was deemed even slightly.
How did they do it? How did they manage to execute thousands of people across France so quickly? What was the administrative mechanism of fear?
They codified it through specific legislation. The key was the Law of Suspect, which was passed in September 1790. This law allowed for the arrest of anyone merely suspected of counter-revolutionary.
Or anyone who hadn't constantly demonstrated their devotion to the revolution.
Exactly. The criteria was so vague it could be used to target pretty much anyone for any.
Then you had the revolutionary tribunals, which were set up to process these suspects rapidly. And the sources confirm this period is thoroughly documented and heavily studied by historians, precisely because it shows how legal processes can just be corrupted to justify mass political execution.
Defendants had few rights, if any, and the penalty was almost always death by
the guillotine, which was initially presented as this humane, egalitarian way to die.
It became the ubiquitous symbol of unbridled state power. Historians estimate tens of thousands were executed. The exact number is hard to pin down, but the impact of that pervasive fear known as the Great Terror in its final months was catastrophic.
It really was a revolution eating its own children. You have leaders of yesterday's moderate factions being executed today because the political center had shifted so far to the extreme left that anyone who wasn't a radical was suddenly an enemy of the revolution.
And that raises these profound ethical questions about the ends justifying the means. These radical idealists, in their attempt to build a utopian republic of virtue, they effectively turned themselves into the very tyrants they claim to have overthrown.
Arbitrary, absolute, and violent.
The terror showed that when political goals are placed above basic human rights, the tyranny that results is far more brutal than the monarchy it replaced.
But in the end, the terror consumed its own architects, didn't it? The sheer scale of the violence meant that eventually everyone in power started to fear for their own life.
Precisely. The instability caused by the arbitrary nature of it all led to a backlash. The attempt to stabilize came in July 1794, when leading members of the convention who were terrified they'd be next on Robespierre's list turned on it.
The Thermidorian reaction?
Yes, it resulted in the overthrow and execution of Robespierre and his key ally, and that marked the definitive end of the Terror.
So after this intense period of self-destruction, a new, more moderate government was established. They tried desperately to stabilize the country, to bring the revolution back to a calmer course. But the damage was done. The country was exhausted and incredibly vulnerable. So even with the Terror over and the extremists purged, the sources are really clear that the government that replaced them, it was called the Directory, was just inherently flawed and fragile. France was still chaotic.
The Directory was defined by, well, economic instability, rampant corruption, and just constant political infighting between the monarchist remnants on one side and the surviving radicals on the other.
The country was just emotionally and politically exhausted.
Absolutely. They had cycled through every political system you can imagine. Absolute monarchy, constitutional monarchy, a radical republic, a regime of terror, all in less than 10 years. And the central issue was that no stable political consensus could be formed.
The revolutionary ideals were still powerful.
But the practical machinery of government just kept failing, and it often had to rely on the military to put down domestic uprisings.
And that reliance on the military, that's a key transitional detail, isn't it?
Yeah.
Every time the Directory needed to survive a coup attempt or to quell a riot, they called in the generals.
And that steadily shifted real power away from the civilian legislature and toward the armed forces.
And into that vacuum of persistent chaos, the military solution inevitably presented itself.
Right. And the sources introduced the figure who just masterfully capitalized on this instability, Napoleon Bonaparte. He was a rising military hero. He'd achieved these spectacular successes defending France's borders and expanding its influence, especially in Italy and Egypt.
So Napoleon had this public reputation as being strong, competent, and crucially, as a national savior. He was seen as the one person who could restore order and protect the gains of the revolution.
Like legal equality and the security of property.
Without resorting to the bloodshed of the Terror or the corruption of the Directory.
The Directory's weakness gave him the perfect opportunity. In the eyes of many, they had just squandered the revolution's achievements through their own incompetence. The only successful, respected institution left in France during this period was the...
And this brings us to the definitive end date. By late 1799, Napoleon decides the political structure is too weak to guarantee any kind of stability. So, using his popularity, and with the help of some key political schemers, he stages a coup d'etat.
The famous coup of 18 Brumaire.
Yep.
It was a swift, decisive move. Napoleon's forces basically dissolved the legislature and replaced the Directory with a new three-person executive body called the Consul. And Napoleon was the leading figure, the first consul.
And that act, a military general seizing executive power, that marked the official end of the French Revolution as a distinct period. It was a chaotic bookend to a chaotic decade.
Historians are unanimous on this. Napoleon's coup ended the revolution and started the new authoritarian Napoleonic era.
We have to acknowledge the devastating cost. I mean, the revolution was incredibly messy and violent, and it ended not in a stable democracy, but with a military dictate. And yet, its historical impact was massive and completely irreversible on a global scale.
I think the most significant long-term consequence is philosophical and systemic. The French Revolution permanently and irrevocably challenged the idea that kings ruled by divine right.
By executing a king.
By executing a king, they demonstrated that political legitimacy wasn't something you inherited, it wasn't God-given. It was contingent on the consent and the will of... This was a seismic shift in political thought that could never be undone.
It just fundamentally shifted the axis of political philosophy. Authority no longer flowed down from heaven through the monarch. It was now understood, at least in theory, to flow up from the people to the government.
That's the Enlightenment concept of popular sovereignty implemented with fire and blood.
And this message, it wasn't contained within French borders. The events in France were a massive catalyst for democratic and nationalist movements all over the world.
It provided a revolution. You had a declaration of right, a call for popular action, and a successful example of overthrowing entrenched privilege.
You can just see the ripple effects in the decades that followed. I mean, think about the Haitian Revolution, which successfully overthrew French colonial rule and slavery. It directly invoked the revolutionary language of equality and liberty.
Or the revolutions in Latin America against Spanish rule in the early 19th century. They were also profoundly influenced by France.
And that influence translates directly into modern governance. You can trace the language of modern human rights documents, nearly every modern constitution's affirmation of citizenship, legal equality, separation of power. It goes right back to the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen.
The sources affirm that the core ideas the revolution introduced, right, equality, citizen, they still shape our societies today. It established the vocabulary for modern political debate, even if France itself had to spend the next 100 years trying to figure out how to implement those ideas without collapsing into terror or dictatorship.
It forced the world to grapple with the meaning of citizenship and the source of political power.
And despite all its contents, starting with economic despair but defining itself through this abstract philosophy, its central contribution was providing a permanent, tangible example of a nation rejecting inherited status for merit and popular will. The philosophical genie could not be put bottle.
So the lesson is clear. The immediate pressure of economic need drove people into the street. They were fighting for bread, for survival. But in the process of fighting for that survival, they ended up changing the entire framework of government legitimacy worldwide. What a lightning-fast, tumultuous decade we've just covered. We started with a European superpower that was drowning in debt, propelled to fury by skyrocketing bread prices and the deep injustice of the Three Estates. That explosive link led to the National Assembly, the storming of the Bastille, and the philosophical triumph of the Declaration of Rights.
And we tracked the trajectory of those high ideals collapsing into political. It led to the regicide of Louis XVI and the horrific mass execution.
A movement that revealed just how quickly chaos can consume its own